Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our masterclass today about deliberative integrity. We're going to talk about today about the processes of deliberation and their aspects of integrity that you need to consider in order to deploy some of the deliberative democracy exercises and also processes. The class today is called Deliberative Integrity, an inner sight to governance processes, the new ethical basis of governance. And today we have an invitation, a special invitation actually. We invited today to talk to us to Nicole Curato. And Nicole, I will invite you first to present yourself, and thank you very much for accepting this invitation for today.
Yes, hi Sebastian. Good morning from Canberra, and I guess good evening, good afternoon to where you are. And so, okay, how do I introduce myself? I wear many hats, but for the purposes of this presentation, I am the project lead of a project called Deliberative Integrity. This is a project funded by the Australian Research Council. And as you mentioned, the goal of this project is to examine what it means to create ethical standards in the governance of deliberative mini-publics.
All right, thank you, Nicole. And well, just a quick presentation of mine. I'm going to be having the conversation with Nicole. I'm Sebastian Calderon, project coordinator of DemoReset, and well, having also these conversations through the demo talks and master classes for all of you guys, so that you can see us and watch all the contents that we have in the different demo talks that we have deployed through the whole process. Well, Nicole, just to start the conversation here and to tell us about your incredible and interesting project on deliberative integrity, my first question maybe we can start by defining or maybe having a discussion regarding what makes a deliberative process ethical.
Yes, this is actually a very good question, because part of the project is also grounding our definition of deliberative integrity based on the lived experience of the community of practice of deliberative mini-publics. So perhaps in terms of definition, I'm going to use the term community of practice or community throughout our discussion. And by that, I really just mean policymakers, practitioners, academics, and advocates of deliberative mini-publics. These are people who have designed, commissioned, implemented, and evaluated deliberative mini-publics. And we use the term community because I think that's what we are, right? We're not an industry. We're not necessarily commercialized. We are a community that shares similar interests in running these processes to enhance the quality of democracy in our respective contexts. So your first question, what is deliberative integrity, is actually the hardest one to answer. And the reason for that is because when we interviewed almost 100 people from around the world, unfortunately, English-speaking people only, that's my weakness. I don't speak any other language aside from English and Tagalog. When we asked our respondents to identify integrity risks in their work, what we noticed is the breadth or just the variety of interpretations that people have when they identify integrity risks. We can talk about that later. So I suppose for now, the placeholder definition of deliberative integrity that we're working with is the extent to which the values of deliberative democracy are consistent with the ways in which we practice the governance of deliberative mini-publics. So for example, if the values of deliberative democracy include inclusiveness, open-mindedness, perhaps transparency, and of course, robust reason-giving, are these norms of deliberative democracy implemented or put into practice when we design, implement, and evaluate these processes? So I think that can be a starting point, right? To what extent is our practice of deliberative mini-publics consistent with the values of deliberative democracy?
Okay, Nicole, thank you. And talking about these type of concepts, sometimes you go through when you start also, and this happens also to DemoReset, when you start like implementing some processes to invite together some people to start working around the world to a concept or through a process. Sometimes you go through a lot of concepts, and you have to start explaining sometimes like the differences between these concepts. And seeing the web page and seeing all of the stuff that deliberative integrity is about, I'm asking you also, what is the probably the conceptual differences between integrity, quality, ethics, and other maybe key concepts or key factors to consider?
Yeah, so I think when we think about integrity, conceptually, it's very different from the concept of deliberative quality. Typically, when we talk about deliberative quality, we talk about the extent to which a mini public, for example, realizes, let's say, the value of diversity of perspectives. So we measure or we assess the quality of deliberation based on, for example, were different views put forward by experts, or did the randomly selected participants embody different ideas in deliberation, and did those ideas engage with each other? We can also measure quality in terms of listening, right? Did assembly members or jurors listen to each other in the process of deliberation? We can actually imagine a mini public where all of those things happened, right? Like there is a vigorous contestation of discourses, random selection really got the microcosm of society in the same room. The quality could be good, but it is possible that the integrity of the process is questionable if, for example, the recommendations put forward by the participants at the end of a citizens' assembly or a citizens' jury, when that's turned over to commissioning authorities will just cherry pick or pick their favorite recommendation and ignore the recommendation that they don't really like. From our interviews, a lot of respondents that we talk to think that that is an integrity issue, especially if the commissioning body promised to seriously consider all proposals that the assembly members put forward. Others also raise concerns about integrity issues, for example, in the distance of the implementing body, or let's say the service delivery partners, to the commissioning body. We heard, for example, some stories of practitioners commissioned to do the random selection, and the commissioning authority actually asked them for the list of people that they selected so they can pick names that they don't want to be included in the process. And that is obviously an integrity risk. So I think conceptually, these are very different. Integrity are red lines that are crossed that compromise the ethics of running the process, whereas quality is about the extent to which our expectations of what a deliberative process looks like and what it could do are assessed, observed, or measured.
Thank you. And you surfaced you surfaced something like talking about this question, and thank you, Nicole, for that. You surfaced something like the risks of integrity, right? Can we talk about are there risks in the democratic innovation processes, that are trying to uphold ethical standards of conduct to implement this type of processes? Can we talk about risks in this case?
Yes, absolutely. There are so many risks. And again, I want to emphasize that these risks are risks that the community of practice themselves identified. So I'm not making up these risks. These are based on close to 100 interviews and close to, I think, 50 questionnaire responses that we've received. And one of the most resonant risk that actually we realized, I wasn't actually expecting this, is that for many of our respondents, one of the biggest risks for many publics is how some processes label themselves as a deliberative process, but in fact, they're not a deliberative process. So, for example, some processes call themselves a deliberative mini public, but there's no random selection. Or other processes call themselves to be a deliberative process, but in reality, there's really no deliberation that is happening among the participants. it's basically just like a glorified focus group discussion. And I think there is a lot of discomfort with the community about mislabeling these processes because it compromises the integrity of deliberative mini publics. It compromises, it's like false advertising, right? So to many people, correctly labeling the process is important because that conveys honesty to the participants, but also to the commissioning body. I can name a few more risks, Sebastian, or we can continue talking about this. Well, what do you prefer?
If you want to, to mention some other risks, you can go ahead. Actually, I have, like few other questions, but I would like to if you want to make more explanation on the risks, that will be actually a really good thing, maybe for the people that is watching us.
Yeah, so just in relation to that idea of mislabeling as one of the integrity risks, I think the bigger risk here is many publics are just marketed as such, right? Because it's very trendy, it's a very sexy form of citizen participation, and the worry of our respondents is that by just attaching the word deliberative to a process that's not really deliberative, they're just taking advantage of the so-called deliberative wave without really going through the rigorous process of designing deliberative mini public. So that is the first risk, common risk that we hear from our respondents, calling practices that are deliberative, but they're not actually deliberative. The second risk that I really find interesting is that a lot of respondents that we talk to also worry that one of the biggest risks for many publics today is that it ends up promoting a toolkit for participation that is not sensitive to local contexts. And they worry that many publics have become an off-the-shelf solution, right? It's like, oh yeah, you have a problem in your community, let me design a citizen jury for you. Oh, you have constitutional issues, let's have a citizens assembly for you. So some of our respondents, actually many of our respondents, think that this is an ethical issue because we are in a way imposing a particular design to communities that may not necessarily feel ready for that kind of engagement. So others, or someone actually used the term, it's a way of controlling and dominating people. It's like we're forcing people to fit a certain mold, even if it risks cognitive overload and emotional exhaustion, right? Like anyone who's run a citizen jury knows that it's very tiring intellectually, it's very tiring emotionally because you put your heart and soul into it. And I think the risk here is that when communities are not ready, when many publics are used as a toolkit for participation, maybe we're imposing a kind of democratic process without creating an enabling context for participants to really be effective actors in a mini public. And I think attendant to this is one of the concerns that one of our respondents raised. One of our respondents, actually, Sebastian, quit the mini public community because this respondent really found it unethical that we are subjecting citizens to such emotionally sensitive process. I can't name the process because we promise anonymity, but imagine a process that involves questions of life and death. And she felt that she's not sufficiently trained to give emotional support to participants in that jury. She felt that there were not enough mechanisms for caring for participants when they're emotionally exhausted. And to her, that puts participants in a vulnerable position. And it all goes back to the idea of why are we doing a citizen jury in the first place? Because is it a toolkit for participation? Do we not really contextualize this within the needs of the community? So I think the integrity risk there is the harm that these processes can cause to participants. The other risk that we also noticed is the risk of viewing mini publics as a way for governments to outsource governance to the community of practice, and some of them have commercial interests. Actually, there's a lot of work in the deliberative democracy literature about this. So Carolyn Lee's work on do-it-yourself democracy. It's a very well-written book about the community engagement industry. Carolyn Hendricks and Carson from New Democracy also wrote something similar about the risks of treating the community of practice as a commercialized industry. Because if we see the community as a commercialized, profit-oriented industry, there is the risk or the tendency to prioritize profit motivation over the interests of democracy. But so that's the bad news, right? Like that sounds very risky. That are we just commodifying democracy? And once we commodify democracy, we end up cutting corners. We start using mini publics as a marketing enterprise. We start promising to our clients that, yeah, many publics can really break the deadlock, or yeah, many publics can really deliver epistemically superior outcomes. Like it becomes that marketing exercise, even though academic research or the scholarly evidence really shows that we still need to learn more about how many publics operate, right? We have some evidence, but there's no consensus yet whether it's really the most inclusive process. You're still building that evidence base. But the issue is if we start seeing this as marketing opportunities without necessarily being honest about what we know about deliberative mini publics, about citizens' assemblies. So that is a risk when profit incentive takes over knowledge claims. But I don't mean to sound very sad or ominous about this, but the good news is for many of our respondents, they identify that as a risk, but not really a reality. Meaning when we ask them, so do you see this in the practitioner community? Do you see a lot of people who are cutting corners just so they can sell a product? And typically the answer is no, we haven't seen that yet, but we are conscious that that is the risk. A number of participants in our research also actually felt very cautious about big companies starting to offer deliberative services, and using it again as a marketing tool to get profit without necessarily being committed to the principles. And finally, just if you can indulge me, the final risk that we also gathered from our interviews is the worry about the state co-opting these processes. So there is an excellent book by our colleagues from France who calls participation as just grand spectacles, right? It's just like a performance of citizen engagement. Whereas really, we know that the decisions are already made behind the scenes, right? So there is this worry that the governments or other clients or other commissioning bodies are just running a citizen jury or a citizen assembly, but really they've already made their decision. They just wanted to have this performance or a theater showing that there is citizen participation. And there is that worry that these processes are just used as deodorizers for very stinky positions that the government has already taken. When we ask our respondents, is this common? Is it common that commissioning authorities co-opt the process in the end? Like there's no sincerity in considering the recommendations. A lot of our respondents actually say very obvious or overt forms of co-optation, they're quite rare. But what's more common are more mundane or hidden forms of co-optation. So one example is the issue of time. When the implementers of deliberative mini publics tell the commissioning body that we need 5 months to roll out this process, and the commissioning body says, no, you have a month. So to them, that is a subtle form of co-optation, because if it takes 5 months to run a process and you're pressured to deliver it in a month, then you will not have a robust process, right? You will not be able to take care of your of your participants. And that many of our respondents find is a more subtle way of co-opting the process, risking the integrity of the process, because they're experiencing pressure, time pressure in this case, from the commissioning authority. I can talk about this all day, but I think I will stop there because there's so much to discuss.
Maybe we can have a part 2 of this masterclass to keep discussing about all of the risks. That's actually super interesting because what you said, like we need to stop considering mini publics in this probably market issue or in this market environment, kind of selling to each of the governments, like if it's like the only solution that it's going to solve all the problems of democracy or of participation. Actually, I remember a few years ago. Um, it stopped. Oh no. Yeah. Actually, I remember a few years ago. The thing about digital democracy was this digital democracy is going to solve every problem of democracy, and it's like no, we actually have to assess the processes. We have to learn a lot about these processes and how does these new scenarios or these new environments of political innovation, of democratic innovation, could show us new pathways, but it's not the only solution, right? So it was super interesting that you mentioned actually that. And if hypothetically one person that is seeing this masterclass is going to run, for example, a democratic innovation process, a deliberative democracy process, how can he or she guarantee integrity or control integrity in these democratic innovation processes?
That is a very good question. So this is also one of the questions that we asked our respondents, because when we asked them, okay, these are the risks. So what are the solutions, or what do you do already in your work to respond to these so-called integrity risks? The answer is actually, Sebastian, you'll be surprised. It's actually very controversial. Different people have different interpretations or proposals on how our community can be better at addressing integrity risks. So let me start with the least controversial solution that everyone proposed. And for many people, the least controversial solution is transparency. We just need to be very clear upfront whether we are talking to the commissioning bodies or talking to the citizen jurors or talking to the assembly members. We just need to be very transparent and clear upfront about what this process can achieve and what it cannot achieve. So that's important. And I think a lot of the practitioners, people who deliver and design these processes, a lot of them that we talk to really feel passionately about this. It's actually quite rare that we talk to someone who treats mini publics as a marketing enterprise, right? They're very honest when they talk to commissioning authorities that this I can deliver, this I cannot deliver. Others even put their, what do they call that? Red lines when they talk to their clients. Like, for example, they will say, the minute you interfere with participant selection, we're walking away from this process. We're not going to work on this process. The minute you manipulate our facilitators, or you ask our facilitators to ask leading questions that's not part of our program design, we are going to quit this contract. So there is this clarity of expectations, transparency of expectations from the beginning. So that is least controversial, but I also want to say that transparency is not necessarily always the easiest to uphold in a mini public, primarily because the virtue of transparency also conflicts with some of the virtues of deliberative politics, like, for example, privacy and confidentiality. So, for example, my colleagues and I we're commissioned to evaluate the citizens' jury on genome editing in the UK. It's a very exciting topic. And one of the responses that we got from the evaluation from the jurors was that they felt that people with serious genetic conditions were not really heard in deliberations. And so we put that on the report. But the problem is, but the truth is actually, there were people with serious genetic conditions who were part of the mini public, and they were actually very vocal and very active. But people with serious genetic conditions preferred not to disclose their conditions to the jury. They feel that that's a privacy issue, right? Like, they will not disclose their medical conditions to the group. So what do you do there? You want to be transparent about the selection of participants to demonstrate that people with a variety of lived experience about genetic conditions are present. But we also need to respect the demands for privacy, especially when it's a sensitive issue. So that is the tricky part. We want to be transparent, but transparency cannot be upheld all the time because it's in conflict with other virtues. So that's the first response to integrity, transparency. The other common response that we typically hear is to create a mechanism to monitor the integrity of the mini public. And this is where it gets exciting, Sebastian, because some people argue, or some of our colleagues in the community, they argue that we actually need international standards that can govern all the mini publics happening around the world, right? So others were talking about the OECD standards, others were talking about a more co-created set of standards that can be applicable to both global north and global south contexts. Others are saying that these international standards are good, but they should not be overly prescriptive, meaning the standards should be broad enough so local contexts and local practitioners can adapt many publics to their local contexts, right? So there is that debate. Others are saying that yes, monitoring is good, but they're also conscious about hiring external evaluators who can observe the process from a distance, because they think that the best way to monitor a mini public is for evaluators to understand the context and the history of the mini public, to understand the complexities in the entire process, rather than just hiring external evaluators to just jump in, judge the process based on a set of standards without understanding the history and the context of that process. So to me, that is an exciting debate, right? Do we need an international benchmark, or do we need to very heavily localize these standards? And then at the other end of this debate about creating international standards or monitoring mechanisms is maybe these standards are just another neo-colonial move of global north institutions imposing a view of what is acceptable and what is best practice in different contexts around the world. So this view is not super mainstream, but it's a view that we also get from a number of respondents who are very wary of these international standards, which actually, if I may share, this really reminds me of the debate about corruption, right? And I mean, the global South practitioners are very much familiar with this, because I think in the 90s and the early 2000s, corruption was the big development project that a lot of people were bidding for. And I think the debate then is we need to internationalize standards on anti-corruption, right? So the so-called advocates of good governance support international regulations to curb corruption. And, there are, global standards for corruption regulation. But others, particularly anthropologists, are actually saying that, but corruption is contextual. What is construed as a bribe in some societies is construed as a gift. So these global standards of corruption are the intention may be good, but really it's imposing a particular view of the world to societies that see relationships and governance in a very particular and personalistic way. And we need standards of corruption that are more in line with local cultures and local contexts. So to me, the community of practice is actually faced with a fork in the road. We can either take a path where we want to create a common international standards in the same way that the field of anti-corruption has taken, or we can take the path that the anthropologists want us to take, which is to say it's very contextual. International standards can be a neo-colonial move, and we should just give the community of practice enough space to define what to them is a practice with ethics and integrity. And I think that debate is very much alive. And then finally, and this is just really a short point, but I think it's very interesting. A lot of our respondents also suggested that aside from transparency and creating a monitoring mechanism, for many of them, and this is a bit philosophical, the best response or the best way to safeguard the integrity of a mini public is to make sure that your mini public confronts power. A mini public has integrity if it constrains somebody's power, whether we're talking about coercive leadership or technocrats or demagogues or purveyors of disinformation. A mini public with integrity necessarily curtails the power of people who have power. And if your mini public does not constrain the power of people who already have power, then there's something wrong about your mini public, right? So I think that's really powerful. It's very philosophical. And I love this insight because it also demonstrates that many of our respondents see the big picture, that we are doing mini publics because we're not happy with the distribution of power in society. We want to shift the power to ordinary, everyday citizens. And if your mini public does not do that, if your mini public just reinforces the power of people who already have power, then what's the point? Then maybe your mini public has no integrity. So yeah, I'll stop there. What do you think?
Wow, that's really, really beautiful and exciting. Yeah, to have these inspirational ideas. Like you have to confront power in order to develop some of the deliberative democracy processes, mini public, citizen assemblies, citizen juries, and a lot of things that we might discover in the implementation and deployment of other deliberative democracy tools. Actually, well, DemoReset aims to recognize some of the deliberation processes across global south, and we will have to discover a lot of global south experiences in regarding this. So this is a beautiful insight that we come up to this in this class. We have to confront power actually, and we will have to discuss and keep debating on the international standards or the local recognition of each of the biases and of the challenges of these type of processes. But it's really a really interesting debate and point of view. And talking about also the standards, the mechanisms, Nicole, what do you think is the role, for example, of regulatory authorities in upholding integrity, for example, regarding democratic innovation processes or deliberation processes?
This is a very good question because at the moment, at least for majority of the world, democratic innovations are still ad hoc processes, right? They're not necessarily institutionalized. And that is the worry. If they're not institutionalized, which regulatory agency do they report to? So some of our respondents are actually saying, we don't need to recreate the wheel, right? There are already open governance principles that are present in many societies. So, I mean, obviously, in different countries, different government and regulatory agencies are in charge of rolling out open government principles. But one of the insights that we got from our interviews is that why don't we just anchor democratic innovations based on open governance principles? Because anyway, they are consistent and they reinforce each other. So that's one possibility. The other possibility is to think about existing institutions of democracy that experience credibility or that enjoy credibility, and let them and put them in charge in running these processes and monitoring these processes. And here, my favorite example is Ireland, right? Like Art O'Leary, iconic that he is, right? Actually, I got this insight from him where he said that actually the Irish Electoral Commission is also now empowered to run these processes. And obviously, electoral commissions in many parts of the world are, well, not in many parts of the world, but in some parts of the world, enjoy high levels of credibility because they're perceived as impartial. And if we trust these institutions to run our elections, then we should also trust these institutions to run our citizens' assemblies because they are independent from partisan politics. So that is another possibility, because without this regulation or without this institutional configuration on how to make sure many publics remain independent from partisan politics, then many publics will always be at risk of being accused of being used by left-wing governments to justify progressive policies, or instrumentalized by activists to get outcomes that they want, right? It will always be held suspect. But if the authority that is running it are credible institutions, then I think many publics will be in a better position to enhance their credibility. There are also emerging governance mechanisms that we see in Belgium and in other parts of the world. But yeah, I think the Irish example is a good starting point.
Well, Nicole, thank you very much for all the information. We're really excited to see the developments on this process that you're running with a different community of practitioners, of people that is working towards this. We would like to invite you after a quick video to just maybe make some three conclusions, three main things or ideas that the people that see this masterclass should consider when deploying or when working towards a deliberative democracy process. So maybe let's go with a video, and then you can start with the three conclusions.
Okay, my three conclusions. So in this talk, I basically talked to you about some of the integrity risks that the community of practice identified. And I also talked to you about the possible solutions that the community of practice identified. The key headline of my talk really is to say the debate in the community is very much alive, right? Should we have international standards? What kind of monitoring mechanisms should be there? To what extent should many publics constrain power? What institutional configurations should be there to ensure the integrity of many publics? These are very much open. These are ongoing debates. So I think in conclusion, there are three pathways for our field. The first is we can continue talking about this, and we can try to find consensus and create common standards. So that's one pathway. Another pathway is we can continue talking about this, crystallize the extent of our disagreements, and recognize that maybe we will never really agree on these debates, and that's okay, right? The third pathway is for us to keep talking about this and wait for the field to mature even more before we make any decisions on how we can together build the integrity of many publics. But whichever pathway we take, I think the bottom line here is we need to keep talking to each other.
All right, Nicole, thank you very much. I have to say that we're really grateful, and it's really a pleasure to talk to you, to discuss these type of things, to keep working together, and hopefully the integrity process could also support a lot of things and a lot of deployment of these processes on DemoReset. As I told you, we are going to work towards recognizing more and more processes, alternative processes of deliberation in what we call the global south, in sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, and Southeast Asia, and Eastern Europe. So we definitely have to consider when we assess probably, or when we discover this type of process, we will have to consider the type of integrity that they used when they deployed those processes. So thank you very much. I have to say that it's really, really a pleasure. Nicole is one of the persons that has been more aware on the involvement of the project, on the evolution of the whole project of DemoReset. So thank you very much, and we hopefully keep working together, Nicole.
Fantastic. Thank you for the invitation.
All right.